Hi, welcome back. This is the CineFiles. I'm Eric Cohen, producer and co-host of this show. Today we're going to discuss something I think a lot of our fans have been eagerly awaiting for. We're going to talk about the Daniel Craig era of James Bond. Think of this as sort of a pseudo-sequel to our James Bond series. Call it James Bond 3.5. Since we did 3 episodes running through the whole canon a long time ago. We briefly touch upon Casino Royale towards the end of that series, but we didn't spend enough time on it, so now we have an opportunity to do just that. And now Spectre, the 4th James Bond film starring Daniel Craig, is in production, and we're probably most likely going to see a trailer by summertime. We thought it'd be appropriate to talk about the 3 films that Craig has made as James Bond. But before we continue, to my left, Andre Joseph, and to his left, Mr. Jeff Galashaw, also the host and producer of Unfinished Business. Just to backtrack a little bit, it was announced that Pierce Brosnan was no longer going to play Bond.
Okay.
And it had a bit of a bitter aftertaste to it. It seemed like that was something Brosnan was not prepared for. In interviews, he was saying he's ready to do another Bond film, all that stuff, and suddenly Brosnan's no longer Bond. And then if you saw news reports, interviews with him, he seemed to be a bit bitter about what happened there. So this big thing about they're going to reboot the series, whatever, a screenplay went out there by Neil Purvis and Wade, the guys who originally had been writing all the Brosnan Bond films, and it wasn't getting good reviews. This is before, for example, Drew McWeeny, a.k.a. Moriarty, when he was still on Ain't It Cool News, had managed to snag a copy and read the script and was just trashing it. And he's a famous James Bond fan, both of the novels and the films. And then the casting rumors went underway. Remember Clive Owen was brought up a lot as a possible new James Bond. Hugh Jackman's name kept coming up. Then it started you started to hear bits and pieces about Daniel Craig. Just little bits and pieces here and there. Layer Cake, Steve Layer Cake's probably... And they're thinking about Bond. They're thinking about him as Bond. My initial reaction to those initial rumors at first was I like Daniel Craig. I've admired his work so far. But is he a good Bond? Would he be a good Bond? I couldn't figure that out. I couldn't. Even people say, well, you see Layer Cake, maybe. I was like, no, I don't even see it out of Layer Cake. I don't. And that's because I had such a strong preconceived idea physically of what Bond is. From Connery. I mean, even Roger Moore might have been, you could argue, sort of the odd man out. He has sort of sandy blonde hair-ish. He's not really brunette. He doesn't have that hardened, tough look like a Connery. I would say Brosnan, Dalton, and Connery fell more in that mold than Roger Moore did.
Okay.
But Craig was so different physically. You just can't see it. Although I thought he was a good actor.
Okay.
Then it became more and more clear, they're seriously looking at this guy, and then they made the announcement. Now, apparently, it wasn't so much down to him and Henry Cavill, now known as Superman, and now will soon to be seen as another iconic super spy guy named Napoleon Solo in the Man from U.N.C.L.E. movie. It was simply that they had screen-tested Cavill just in case things didn't work out with Craig. They wanted Craig from the get-go.
Okay.
But Cavill was in wings waiting. They were reluctant to go with him, though, because at the time he was too young. He was barely 23, 24.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Bond's got to be near 40.
Well, keep in mind, I don't necessarily think he has to be near 40. Keep in mind that George Lazenby was 29.
Okay.
Keep in mind Sean Connery was 31 when he starred in Dr. No. Okay. Granted, people looked older in those days, right?
Well, I mean, my thing is, since this was, at the time, did they know this was going to be a younger, kind of a beginning story for Bond more?
The idea was that this was a reboot. This was Bond's first mission.
Okay.
We should also talk a little about the history of Casino Royale, why that was never officially adapted. A long time ago, prior to, before there was an Ian Productions, before there was a Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, right, the guys who initiated the whole James Bond thing. Even before there was this attempt to do a James Bond film that wound up becoming the script for Thunderball, okay? Even before that, because that could have been the first James Bond film. There was an attempt to buy rights to the first Ian Fleming James Bond novel, Casino Royale. And those are rights bought to do a sort of TV episode I think it was called Mystery Climax Theater in the 1950s.
Barry Nelson.
Barry Nelson of The Shining
Jimmy Bond.
played
Oh, jeez.
played Jimmy Bond, and they made Felix Leiter a British agent. Peter Lorre played Le Chiffre. And it's quaint. You can watch. It's online. It's easy to find. It's actually very quaint, kind of amusing to watch. But that whoever had the rights to Casino Royale. I believe the guy's name was Charles Feldman. He had held on to those rights, and then when the James Bond craze hit in the 60s, he wanted to make his own competing James Bond film. Tried to get Connery to do it. Connery was committed to. He didn't want to. If he had to do Bond, he was committed to the series he was already doing. Otherwise, he didn't want to. He was already falling fast out of love with the character at that point. And so Charles Feldman decided to go the other direction and say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to do a comedy. I'm going to do a parody. And he cast, Woody Allen, Peter Sellers, David Niven, Orson Welles, right?
Ursula Andress was in it.
Right, and Ursula Andress and all these people. And that became Casino Royale, the only film version, which really wasn't a film version. It was this crazy comedy satire on, super spy stuff in general. And that was it. That was the adaptation we got. Flash forward many years later, somehow Sony Pictures got their hands on the rights to Casino Royale as a film property. Sony Pictures take up the distribution rights for all of Eon films, which was originally handled by United Artists. Mm-hmm. Sony took over. And in that process, those rights to Casino Royale reverted back to Eon Productions, and therefore they could make an official adaptation of Casino Royale. And since it was the first book in the series, why not reboot the whole franchise and make it the first official James Bond adventure?
But wasn't Quentin Tarantino looking to adapt Casino Royale for himself with Brosnan playing the part?
Tarantino put it out there he wanted to do that. I think that was a big publicity stunt on Tarantino's part, where he'd gone on, like on talk shows, says, no, they made that because of me, because I suggested doing it. And there's no proof that he actually approached them. There's no proof that they actually considered him or didn't consider him. I would love to have seen Tarantino.
That would have been interesting.
That's the other thing, too, is what I find most hard to believe, yes, Eon has a reputation for, or had a reputation for being more controlling in terms of controlling the image and the product of their James Bond franchise. But I find it hard to believe they would turn down the opportunity to have Tarantino. Quentin Tarantino directed James Bond film,
especially at the time when he was like.
So exactly. Yeah. So I just find I think Tarantino's full of bluster and bullshit whenever he recasts the story. Okay, Jeff, since you weren't a part of. Okay. Well, neither was Andre, but Andre's the new blood. You're the veteran who wasn't able to be part of that discussion. What are your thoughts? First off, give us your thoughts on James Bond in general. Because you're not necessarily a James Bond fan.
Only because I guess really it just seems like an ongoing movie series, and I guess with all the different actors, the first James Bond movie I ever saw was Octopussy with Roger Moore, and then I generally saw A View to a Kill. And for a long time, that was all I knew of James Bond. I knew there were Sean Connery movies. I knew there were many actors who played it, but I never really bothered to really get into the series because it's sort of like book series for me. I know if I start it, I'm going to have to go through the whole gambit. So unless there's something that's really pulling me in, I really don't want to get into that. So I really just stayed away from them. The Brosnan years, I saw the trailers. I eventually saw Tomorrow Never Dies because Michelle Yeoh was in it, and that's really the only reason I watched it. And then more when we started the CineFiles, you guys would constantly talk about James Bond movies. So I thought, it's only fair, let me start checking them out.
What are you talking about?
I still haven't watched most of the films, but I saw the George Lazenby film on Her Majesty's Secret Service. I saw that one. And, I've rewatched A View to a Kill because, I just wanted to see it.
Have you decided what you thought was the best versus what was the worst? Do you find that by, let's say, for example, the ones you thought were best, do you see why there's an allure there? Do you get?
I can see the allure. I mean, my thing is that I unfortunately started off with, no offense to him, but I started off with the worst with Roger Moore. No, I've never seen a Timothy Dalton one.
By the way, it's okay because Jeff is notorious for like watching like franchises starting with like the last one first and going backwards. Up until Casino Royale, there was no continuity amongst the Bonds, so you could start anywhere and it wouldn't matter.
Exactly.
So you're okay. You're off the hook in this case.
So I was like, okay, I can see the allure, but like when it's a Roger Moore film, I can see it more going through the motions of like, okay, we're supposed to have a scene like this. We're supposed to have a scene like this. And it didn't really feel like, I guess, no passion in the project. Then when you watch, let's say, a Sean Connery or even a George Lazenby, the film is moving forward and it still manages to keep you interested.
And you find there are patterns. There are films that are much sillier than others.
Yes, definitely.
Much campier than others, especially during the Moore era.
Exactly.
And then you have
Where I
films where it's
started.
like, whoa, this is really interesting, like On Her Majesty's Secret Service, dark ending. And you have like From Russia with Love, which is, I said this in the last show, to me, this is a James Bond film that Alfred Hitchcock directed a James Bond film. That's From Russia with Love, because there's so many set pieces in this film that are worthy of Hitchcock. Okay. That fight scene alone between Bond and Red Grant in the train car is some of the best fight choreography. It's one of the best fight scenes put on film. It's just so bloodthirsty, and it's weird because it's like done in the early 1960s when they hadn't nailed fight choreography or things like that yet, right? And that era of cinema. But here it's like this down and dirty, bloodthirsty where they're just like doing anything to try to win that fight, short of like biting each other's hands and stuff. It's really well done. Plus, it's in a really enclosed, small space, which is the cabin of a train car, right? So, but From Russia with Love is, I guess, my favorite Bond film.
Well, the first time I was really exposed to it was when License to Kill was coming out, and they had the previews on with every other movie that was coming out that summer. But I didn't really see the hype. I didn't really know much about James Bond up until that point, and this might be a little embarrassing to say, but I was a big fan of the James Bond Jr. cartoon when that was on the air. And
That's awesome. Come on.
yeah, I mean, at the
Why
time,
not?
it was really cool, but, it's obviously a black sheep in the Bond franchise, but I just loved that character and how they used the old villains, and
I never understood why the villains would want to have anything to do with these kids.
yeah, it was always bizarre.
And they're like souped up supervillain versions of themselves,
He drank a milkshake instead of a martini.
Oh man.
But what I really got into the movies was when GoldenEye came out, and I remember there was like an infomercial that had like the whole box set to sell. And
Oh, another question. James Bond Jr.
what about it?
Wasn't he supposed to be Bond's nephew in a cartoon?
They never explained that clearly. They said it was supposed to be his nephew, and that Felix Leiter's son.
So
is
his
like a
brother's
surfer.
name is James?
Yeah, I've never quite figured that out.
Where did the brother come from?
He was a kid watching it. He doesn't know.
Yeah, I don't question this shit.
I love how Felix Leiter's son is in school with him. He's like a dumb surfer dude.
So I saw GoldenEye, loved it. Then I decided I was going to buy the ridiculously expensive box set from your old stomping ground, the Virgin Megastore. And
Okay.
Were you at Virgin Megastore or were you at Tower?
I was at both,
You're at both,
actually.
okay.
yeah, so I spent maybe all of '96 going through all of the 16 films and buying the soundtracks, buying whatever toys were available, and just being enamored with the character and all those films.
So that we just talked about Bond films. We kind of got lightly into the history. We talked a lot about it in our previous Bond show. It was a 3-parter. So let's continue on with the Craig era. We talked about how Craig was finally cast as Bond. Mm-hmm. My impression when he was cast, I was like, interesting. It's like they cast Sean Penn as Indiana Jones. I like Sean Penn. I think he's a fantastic actor. But is he a good Indiana Jones? That's how I felt about Daniel Craig. Because I was familiar with his indie work.
Okay.
And I always saw him as a character actor. Layer Cake was the first thing I saw where he played sort of a sexy leading man kind of part. Because prior to that, what was he in? He was in Tomb Raider.
Yeah, Tomb Raider.
Tomb Raider, and he was in that
The Power of One.
In Tomb Raider, he didn't make much of an impression to me.
and he was in that Tom Hanks movie.
Road to Perdition.
He made a great impression on me in Road to Perdition. I thought he was fantastic in that. But that was my reference. It's like Road to Perdition, Layer Cake. He also did, what was that film? Was it Eternal Love?
Oh, I know the movie you're talking about. Yeah, the weird one with Reese Ifans.
Yeah, which is an interesting film, and Craig is very good in it. He was also in.
A kid in King Arthur's court.
Yeah, well, he's been in a
He
lot.
was in that movie. I've seen that film.
And he did a lot of television. He did a lot of
Okay.
television, a lot of miniseries in Britain and stuff like that. So he had like this great body of like, technically, he is next to Dalton. He's probably the most versatile actor to have been cast in that part of Bond.
Well, at least he wasn't wearing the tight suits Dalton was in his.
So Dalton didn't wear tight suits.
I remember the poster.
Dalton wore like 80s style ill-fitting suits.
No, he was wearing like a rock star tight suit in the poster for The Living Daylights. Even though I've never seen the film, I remember the poster.
Well, if you watch the movies, it's like he's wearing very, very ill-fitting 80s style suits.
Okay, well, I'm just going by the poster.
But yeah, sorry, I don't.
Again,
agree.
I didn't see the film.
I don't agree. Got a lot of flack. A lot of people, they had a whole website was set up called CraigIsNotBond.com.
Yeah. Wasn't there like something where it's like, oh, he can't drive stick?
Yeah, there's
like
something
they were
like
coming
that.
up with little
He looks
things.
like Ed O'Neill.
He got like during like a stunt scene. It looks like Ed O'Neill. During a stunt scene, he apparently lost a cap.
He broke
to
a
his tooth.
tooth.
And everyone's like he's too weak. What didn't help was the press conference. Every time they announce a new Bond in the next film, they do a press conference, right? Where they bring the director and all the crew together, and they have to introduce the new actor in a really cheesy way to establish he's the new Bond. With Dalton, they did this bullshit where they hired a guy to parachute in. And then they cut away and had Dalton walk out like he was the one who parachuted in. That kind of stuff. The one with Pierce Brosnan was actually pretty just subtle. It was just he just showed up.
Yeah, it was just
And I find
we
it
knew
kind
who
of
he was.
even more amusing that everyone was complaining about the fact that Craig shows up. He's wearing a suit. He looked fine. He wasn't buffed up yet. It's because he wore a life preserver vest. Because it was like the British Navy, or Coast Guard, drove him in a boat over the Thames so that they could drop him off his press conference.
I believe at the press conference, they asked him point blank, "Are you going to dye your hair?"
And then something interesting happened. The film goes into production. Little images, stills from the production are starting to leak in newspapers, stuff like that. We're starting to get our first look at Craig as Bond. And suddenly people are like, wait a second. He actually looks kind of good. It's different, but he looks kind of badass. And then the trailer came out, Casino Royale trailer, which was actually a really good trailer. I remember that came out, and everyone else was like, that's a really good trailer. Craig looks good. We like the tone of this. Okay, people are starting to warm up. They're like, okay, let's see where this goes. Then finally the movie comes out. Up to this point, Casino Royale was the most well-received critically of all the Bond films. It's the first Bond film to receive a BAFTA nomination for Best Picture. It's the first Bond film where the actor received a BAFTA nomination. Not that that means anything. It's just that it was probably the most critically acclaimed Bond film ever up to that point. And we all saw it. Mm-hmm. I personally thought it was a revelation. I was somewhat skeptical hearing about the reboot thing. I still was on the fence about Craig, but I was willing to give it a shot. I was just like, wow, this is the Bond film I've been waiting for. I'm a huge fan of Ian Fleming. All you guys are on our Facebook group know this. We've had long discussions about the subject. I was like, this is an Ian Fleming James Bond film. And I thought Craig was fantastic.
Well, do you also think maybe it was also because of his knowledge? Since arguably, like Sean Connery, he started in the films, and then by the time you get to Roger Moore, there's kind of a history to the character. There are books, but it's not maybe... It's a well-known character, but not as much information. But when we get up to Craig's, time for him to take it, he has all this information, at his feet that he can research and make certain decisions for his performance. Do you think that might have affected?
It might have, but at the same time, if you see what he did, it was like he ignored all that.
Okay.
Because his Bond, obviously, first of all, if you're doing the conceit that he's not a fully formed Bond yet, it's about him figuring out who he is as a character. I'm not talking about Craig as an actor. I'm talking about Bond as a character. So that's part of it. Bond isn't that super suave, confident guy yet. He's just learning the ropes. This is his first mission as a 00 agent. However, I think it seemed to me, the impression I got that Craig probably ignored all that.
Okay.
Maybe he went to the books, the original source, right?
Could be.
because even though he doesn't like it's just to say that Fleming barely describes what Bond looks like in the novels. Okay. You know, he describes he does say that Bond has black hair. He does say that. He says that Bond has like very narrow eyes and a cruel mouth. You know, all that stuff. He said that he there was a reference he makes. One character says that Bond looks like Hoagie Carmichael. Now, if you don't know who Hoagie Carmichael was, he's a popular piano player, singing guy, actor guy. He was in The Best Years of Our Lives. He was a friend. He was a piano player in the bar.
Okay.
Right. That's Hoagie Carmichael. That's who Ian Fleming said Bond looks like in his books, right? Nothing like the other guys. The other interesting physical trait Bond has is a scar down his cheekbone, which none of the actors ever, you know, a physical defect none of the actors ever use. So Craig does not necessarily look like that Bond. However, he absolutely captures the essence of Fleming's Bond in a way none of the other actors have before, even more so than Dalton. Dalton, who tried. I don't think the script still supported the way Dalton was trying to interpret that character.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was culture shock to me as it was coming out. Like, I was just anti-Daniel Craig. And for all the reasons everybody had said. He's blonde, he doesn't look like the typical Bond that I'm used to. And then when I first saw the movie, I didn't even want to see it in the theater. I just waited for it on DVD. And I was already kind of shocked that they got rid of the gun barrel sequence. And you know, just having to reestablish him in that world and trying to make him more flawed, more human, but not in the way that's been done in other films where they've tried and they've never been all that successful, other than maybe on Her Majesty's Secret Service, but not to that degree. Instead of making Bond a superhero, they made him more human in the sense of, you know, you see, as they do in the novel, he's having to constantly go back and forth into the card game, getting getting his body beaten the shit out of by the bad guys, and having to constantly go back and his arms bleeding, and you know, the shower scene, and then the torture scene alone. I mean, this was a guy that was feeling pain, and then finally finds love, and then that's stripped away from him, and you see why he's such a cold character.
And they made him complicated in a way that he wasn't. They turned him into a complex character, which is really interesting. And you know how you see why they cast someone like Daniel Craig in a role.
I, like Andre, waited for it to be on DVD, and really the only reason I watched it was Eva Green, because I liked her so much in The Dreamers. So I decided I'll give this film a shot. I mean, from what I knew of Bond, I could tell the film was very different because, again, it's more the character's more complex. It's not, you know, I guess as you were saying, it's not as fantasy filled, it seems. I mean, I enjoyed like the little aspects. Like I remember the action sequences specifically because I remember when he's driving down the road and trying to avoid running her over and the car turning over, and then the parkour fights with the assassins. I thought that was very impressive. But the torture scene, as he was mentioning, was one of the most memorable things in the film, and I thought, wow, this film is like really dark, and my type of action, I like more dark action. I mean, I don't mind fantasy action. You know, throw me a Die Hard, I'll be happy. But this time it was just like, it feels a little more personal, a little more real. Like this character, even though we know is not going to die, could die. There's that realm. It was in that realm of possibility. So I was like, wow, this is really good. You know, this is like nothing like I know of James Bond. So I mean, I'm not going to say it made me a fan of the series from that film, but I thought, well, okay, this is something different. This is something interesting that maybe in the future I would watch, you know, a sequel or the continuing adventures of.
I think Casino Royale is one of the best Bond films in the franchise. It's definitely one of the best written films, the best acted. The director did a really good job. The guy who directed GoldenEye, Martin Campbell, did a really good job returning to the franchise, reintroducing this kind of James Bond. And I thought it was one of the better directed Bond films on top of all that. And I didn't miss the tongue-in-cheek stuff. It's all of a sudden. I really enjoyed this new world, this new take. And they've attempted to go serious with Bond before, many times, sometimes more successfully than others. But I thought that this was like one of the rare occasions where they just hit all the notes just right.
It's the one time where you say to yourself, I don't want to be James Bond. He's like on my level because he's more vulnerable and he is a guy who is more mortal, and also the fact that he's just such a flawed character that you see why he's so cold, and he's an alcoholic, and You know, just all those real world elements that make him more of a fascinating character than what you had previously.
Yeah, and he has and that relationship between him and Ava Green, the Vesper Lynd character. By the way, Bond never drank martinis, shaken, not stirred, not in the novels. They got it right in this film. He made up his drink, which is the Vesper Martini, which is now a popular drink in bars. Mads Mikkelsen is great as Lashif.
Oh, he's always good.
I thought it was, and it's interesting. Some people were confused by holding on to Judi Dench as M.
She got better in the part in the Craig era.
I think, I thought she was really good in GoldenEye. I thought it was a great introduction to her take on M, and then something happened where they made her this doting mother type.
Yeah.
Through the rest of the Brosnan era. Whereas in Casino Royale, they made her this like hardened bitch, which is great, and it makes sense because that's what that character needs to be, because she's sending people out to their death, that kind of thing. And there's an interesting dynamic between her and Craig's Bond that develops throughout the series. Mm-hmm. So is that all? Do we have anything else to say about Casino Royale?
Nope.